It's a breed called the Brahman.
Oh yeah, the Brahman is basically legendary in agricultural circles. It is the gold standard for tropical survival.
But the history here, this is what actually stopped me in my tracks.
Okay.
So the source document introduces the Brahman as an American breed of Zebuine beef cattle. First off, before we even get to the geography of it all, what does Zebu mean? Because I'm used to just seeing like a standard cow in a field.
It's a crucial distinction, actually. So in the world of cattle, you basically have two main lineages. You have taurine cattle, which are the typical, flat-backed cows you see in Europe or out in the American Midwest.
The black and white ones or the brown ones.
Exactly. And then you have Zebuine cattle. These originate in South Asia, and their defining feature is this really large, distinct hump over their shoulders.
Oh.
Yeah, along with a prominent dewlap, which is that loose fold of skin hanging right under their neck.
Okay, so they have the hump of that loose skin. But then the text gets into its passport. And this is where I really need you to explain the logistics to me, because my brain couldn't process it.
Let's hear it.
It says this is an American cow. Right. But it was bred in the United States, starting way back in 1885, from cattle that originated in India.
Right.
And it also mentions they were imported at various times from the United Kingdom, from India, and from Brazil. And they were pulling from specific lineages, like, let me make sure I'm reading this right, Gur, Guzara, Indo-Brazil, and Ongole.
Yeah, you got those right.
But wait, the year is 1885. This is decades before commercial flight. Are you telling me American farmers were actively coordinating the shipment of giant Indian cattle across the ocean on 19th century steamships?
They absolutely were.
That is insane.
And it sounds like a logistical nightmare because it was. I mean, think about the reality of moving a massive, living, breathing animal on a steamship in the 1880s.
Right. It's not like you could just put it in a crate and ignore it.
Exactly. You are dealing with violent storms, the constant threat of disease in these cramped, humid quarters, and just the sheer volume of feed and fresh water required for a voyage that could take weeks, if not months.
Wow.
You do not undertake that kind of massive expense and risk just as a hobby.
So why do it? I mean, why not just use the cows they already had in the U.S.?
Because of the environment in places like Texas and the Deep South, the European taurine breeds that early American settlers brought with them, they were completely failing in that climate.
Oh, they just couldn't handle the heat.
They were dying off, breeders were desperate. So they were essentially scouring the globe, looking at these different Indian Zebu lineages like the Gur and the Ongole you mentioned.
Right.
And realizing, hey, we need those exact survival traits or our entire agricultural economy down here is going to completely collapse. So they literally spent a century pulling the best genetics from multiple continents to engineer this ultimate tropical survivor.
Man, and reading the source, I started picturing the Brahman not even as a cow, but honestly like a biological tank.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
It says it has a really high tolerance of heat, sunlight, and humidity, along with good resistance to parasites.
Yes, and the actual mechanics of how it achieves that are fascinating because we often simplify hot climates to just, the temperature on the thermometer.
Right, like, oh, it's 100 degrees out.
Exactly. But heat alone isn't what makes an environment hostile to livestock. It's really a triad of threats.
Okay, what's the triad?
It's relentless direct sunlight, suffocating humidity, and the absolute explosion of parasites like ticks and flies that just thrive in those hot, damp conditions.
Oh, yeah, the bugs. So how does a standard European cow handle that triad?
Very, very poorly. Standard cattle rely heavily on panting to cool down.
Like a dog.
Basically, yeah. And that becomes wildly inefficient when the humidity is high because the moisture won't evaporate from their lungs. Plus, their thick coats trap heat and provide this perfect, cozy little environment for parasites to latch onto and spread disease.
So they basically cook in their own coats while being eaten alive.
Yeah, you put them in a tropical environment, they don't just get uncomfortably hot, they suffer complete systemic failure.
Enter the biological tank. So how does the Brahman's biology actually solve that? Is it all tied to that loose skin you mentioned earlier?
Exactly. That prominent dewlap and the excess skin, they aren't just cosmetic, they act as a massive biological radiator.
No way.
Yeah. By increasing the surface area of their skin, the Brahman allows more heat to simply bleed off into the surrounding air.
Like fins on an engine block.
That is a perfect analogy. And on top of that, their skin is highly pigmented to block out the solar radiation, so it's essentially built-in SPF.
Okay, what about the bugs, though? The ticks and flies.
As for the bugs, their coat is incredibly short and sleek, so there's nowhere to hide. And their skin actually produces a specific type of sebum, which is an oily secretion that parasites absolutely despise.
Wait, it produces its own bug spray?
It's literal bug armor.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, so it makes total sense why a country like Pakistan, which, deals with massive heat waves and high humidity, would look at the Brahman and say, yep, we need that baseline genetic tank.
Precisely. If your primary enemy is a relentless hot environment, the Brahman is the ultimate foundational asset.
But this is where the story pivots. If we look at a country's geography, especially a place with varied terrain, the environment isn't always just purely hot.
Right, weather is dynamic.
Exactly. What if a farmer operates in a region with wild, seasonal swings? Like scorching summers, sure, but followed by freezing, bitter winters. Because a biological radiator is great in July, but I imagine it's a huge liability in January.
It would freeze to death.
Right. You can't just survive the heat anymore. You need an animal with a highly versatile wardrobe. And that brings us to the second breed in our source document, which is the Sussex.
Ah, the Sussex. It is a brilliant counterpoint. If the Brahman is an exercise in pure heat survival, the Sussex is just a masterclass in seasonal adaptability.
And I found the history of this breed utterly fascinating. The source notes that the Sussex is a red breed of beef cattle from southeastern England, specifically an area called the Weald, which covers Sussex, Surrey, and Kent.
Oh.
And their superpower is entirely centered on their coat. The text says they have a thin summer coat with many sweat glands, but then they grow a thick, heavy coat in the winter.
Which is a profound evolutionary advantage. I mean, sweating is something we humans kind of take for granted, but efficient sweat glands are actually a highly specialized feature in the animal kingdom.
Oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah. We mentioned earlier that many standard cattle breeds struggle in the heat because they rely on panting. Well, the Sussex completely bypasses that limitation in the summer. They can actively sweat to regulate their core temperature.
So they sweat it out in August, and then when the English winter rolls in, they basically just grow a parka.
Exactly. But growing a thick winter coat, it requires a significant amount of metabolic energy. It's an investment the animal's body makes.
Right.
So the Sussex has this biological programming to logically switch between, like you said, a breathable linen shirt for the summer and a heavy parka for the winter. And for the farmer, that means they don't have to build expensive climate-controlled infrastructure just to keep the herd alive.
It's the ultimate all-weather transformer.
Very much so.
But I want to dig into their backstory for a second because I think it explains a really strange behavioral quirk mentioned in the text.
Okay, yeah.
So the source says the Sussex descended from draft oxen that were long used on the Weald, and they were only selectively bred into a modern beef breed starting in the late 18th century. Now, a draft ox, that is essentially the tractor of the 1700s, right?
That is exactly what they were. The heavy clay soils of southeastern England were notoriously difficult to plow.
Oh, really thick mud.
Very thick. Horses often just couldn't manage it. You needed the sheer, raw, enduring power of a team of oxen. And for centuries, these animals were the undisputed engines of agriculture. They pulled plows through thick mud. They hauled massive loads of timber. They pulled giant carts. It was grueling, heavy, agonizing labor.
Which brings me to this amazing detail. The text describes their temperament today as placid, but can be very stubborn. So does that history of being a living, breathing tractor actually explain why they act like that today?
It's a perfect example of how behavior is permanently wired into an animal right alongside its physical traits. Think about the requirements for a draft ox back then.
Okay.
If you are breeding an animal to pull a heavy plow for 8 hours a day, you absolutely cannot have an animal that is flighty, nervous, or easily spooked by a loud noise.
Right, because if it panics, it breaks the plow or hurts someone.
Exactly. You need them to be placid. You need them to just endure.
But I'm guessing that same endurance is kind of a double-edged sword.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer force of will required to put your head down and pull a cart out of deep mud day after day, that translates into an incredible stubbornness over generations.
So a Sussex cow essentially has the genetic memory of an ox that says, look, I am capable of working all day, but I will do it entirely at my own pace, and you absolutely cannot force me to move if I decide I don't want to.
That is exactly what's happening. You can't rush them.
I kind of respect it, honestly.
It's a great trait.
And just to paint a picture of what this, stubborn transformer looks like, the source gives us some specific visuals. It describes a rich red-brown coat, and it specifically mentions a creamy white switch to the tail. Now, I'm assuming that's not a literal on-off switch.
No, no. Agricultural terminology can be a bit opaque for outsiders sometimes. The switch just refers to the long tuft of hair at the very end of the tail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which the animal primarily uses like a whip for swatting flies.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It also notes they're medium-sized and long-bodied. And traditionally, they have white horns, though the text makes a point to say that naturally polled strains have also been developed. Now, polled means born entirely hornless, right?
Yes, polled means hornless. And that isn't an accident. It's a genetic mutation that modern breeders actually actively seek out and cultivate.
Wait, why? I mean, if you have an animal that naturally evolved horns, why spend all this time engineering them out?
It basically all comes down to agricultural efficiency and safety.
Okay.
If you are a farmer managing a large herd in close quarters, horns are a massive liability. They cause injuries to other animals, which damages the meat in the hide, lowering the value, and they pose a really significant danger to the farm workers themselves.
That's a good point. Nobody wants to be gored.
Right. So breeding polled strains removes that risk entirely without sacrificing any of the meat yield.
Which is actually the perfect bridge into the second half of our document, because once a region has solved the climate puzzle, whether they use the Brahman to beat the tropical heat or the Sussex to survive freezing winters, the game fundamentally changes. Survival is just step one.
Yes.
Step two is the ultimate goal of commercial farming, which is just sheer mass and efficiency.
Right. Once you aren't worried about your herd surviving the weather overnight, you pivot your entire focus to yield. How do you maximize the absolute amount of food you are producing?
And to understand how farmers achieve massive yield, our source introduces us to two absolute titans of the beef industry.
Oh, these two are fascinating.
Yeah. Let's start with the Charolais. The text tells us this is a breed of taurine beef cattle. So going back to what you said earlier, taurine means they don't have the hump, right? They are a European lineage.
Exactly. Standard flat-backed cattle.
Right. And they originate from the Charolais area in Burgundy, eastern France. They were raised specifically for meat and are often crossed with other breeds like Angus and Hereford. And here's the detail that legitimately made my jaw drop when I was reading this.
The weight.
Yes. The source states they are large-muscled, with bulls weighing up to 900 kilograms. That is nearly 2,000 pounds.
It's massive.
And gets crazier. It notes that one specific bull in England reached a recorded weight of 2 tons. 2 tons.
It is just a staggering number to try and even visualize.
I mean, I looked it up. 2 tons is the weight of a heavy-duty shipping container, or like a massive commercial pickup truck. That is not just an animal. That is heavy machinery with a pulse.
Pretty much.
But here's what I don't understand. Right after dropping that massive weight statistic, the text just casually adds this warning, and what quote? They also tend to be a skittish breed of cattle.
Yeah.
Wait, how on earth does a farmer manage a nervous wreck of an animal that weighs as much as a truck? That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It is dangerous. Highly dangerous. And it perfectly highlights the severe compromises that happen in the extreme ends of selective breeding.
What do you mean by compromises?
Well, when breeders set out to create the Charolais, their absolute singular focus for generations was maximizing muscle mass. They wanted size and they wanted meat yield above all else.
Right, they just wanted the biggest cow possible.
Exactly. But when you select purely for one physical extreme, like getting a 900-kilogram average or a 2-ton outlier, you often inadvertently drag along other genetic traits that are less than ideal.
Oh, I see.
Or at the very least, you just stop selecting for temperament because you are so fiercely focused on size.
So you get this absolute mountain of meat.
Yeah.
But you lose the placid, calm nature of something like the Sussex.
Exactly. With the Sussex, centuries of pulling plows absolutely demanded a calm animal. With the Charolais, farmers looked at the massive profit margin of a 900-kilogram animal and simply decided that, dealing with a flighty, skittish temperament was just a risk worth taking.
Wow.
But it requires a completely different, much more intensive style of management to keep everyone safe. You have to be very careful around them.
Which brings us to the final breed on our list, because it seems to offer farmers a totally different strategy for getting high yields, without just relying on raw, unadulterated mass and dealing with a terrified 2-ton giant. And that is the South Devon.
Ah, the South Devon. This one is a fascinating case study in agricultural economics.
Really? How so?
Well, let's look at the stats.
Okay, well, the source notes that the South Devon is large-muscled, just like the Charolais. But the focus here isn't just on the scale, it's all about the timeline.
Right.
The text specifically highlights that South Devon bulls experience rapid growth and early maturity. It says they can literally begin siring offspring at around 15 to 18 months of age.
Which is very fast.
And on the flip side of that, they have incredible longevity. They can continue working up to the age of 12.
That timeline is the crucial distinction here. If the Charolais represents brute force scale, the South Devon represents peak biological efficiency.
Break that down for me. I mean, why does it matter so much if a bull matures at 15 months?
It all comes down to what we call the feed conversion ratio.
Okay.
Every single day an animal is on a farm, it is actively consuming resources, it is eating expensive feed, requiring water, needing medical care, right?
The meter is always running.
Exactly. So if an animal takes 3 years to reach maturity, that is 3 years of pure expense for the farmer before that animal becomes productive, whether that means producing offspring or going to market for beef.
Ah, I see. So if the South Devon hits maturity at just 15 to 18 months, you are essentially cutting your upfront investment time in half.
Precisely. You are spending significantly less money on feed before the animal starts generating a return. And then the fact that they can work up to age 12 means you don't have to constantly spend money replacing your herd.
Right.
You have this highly efficient, fast-starting, long-lasting biological factory.
And it's not like they are small factories either. The text points out that a fully mature South Devon bull will easily weigh between 1,200 and 1,600 kilograms. That is 2,600 to over 3,500 pounds.
They are massive.
Yeah. And the largest record in South Devon weighed in at a massive 2,000 kilograms. So we were right back to that 2-ton commercial pickup truck weight, but packed into a much more time-efficient and I assume less skittish animal.
It really shows you how many different ways humanity has learned to solve the exact same problem.
It really does. I mean, when you step back and look at these 4 distinct breeds that a country like Pakistan imports, you see 4 completely different strategies to secure a food supply. You have the Brahman, acting as the biological tank, using its loose skin and sebum to conquer the tropical triad of heat, humidity, and parasites.
Right.
You have the Sussex, the all-weather transformer, leveraging its sweat glands and its stubborn working-class draft oxen roots to survive brutal seasonal swings.
Yep.
You have the Charolais, totally ignoring temperament to deliver unparalleled sheer mass. And finally, the South Devon, providing a masterpiece of time efficiency with rapid growth and a super long working life.
And every single one of them was sourced from entirely different corners of the globe.
Yeah, that's the craziest part.
Right. From the United States via India and Brazil, from the heavy clay soils of southeastern England, and from the pastures of Burgundy, France, all of these distinct, highly specialized genetics brought together in South Asia to solve the incredibly complex puzzle of feeding a population in a specific, demanding climate.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I think the takeaway here is actually pretty profound. The next time you think about the global supply chain, or honestly, just the next time you sit down to eat a burger or a steak, I want you to remember this deep dive.
It really changes your perspective.
It really does. Remember that you aren't just eating something local. You are the beneficiary of a centuries-long, globe-spanning journey of human ambition. Breeders have literally spent over 100 years engineering animals with built-in SPF, seasonal wardrobes, and rapid muscle growth. They were swapping genetics across oceans on steamships, all just to ensure that food makes it to your table.
It is arguably one of the greatest, most unseen triumphs of adaptation and global exchange in human history.
It absolutely is.
Right.
But I want to leave you with one final thought today, just something to chew on long after you finish listening.
Okay.
We have spent the last 150 years selectively breeding these exotic cattle for highly specific resilience based on historical climates, right?
Right.
The Sussex was perfected for the predictable cold winters of England. The Brahman was honed for the historical humidity of the tropics. But as we all know, global weather patterns are currently shifting faster than at any point in recorded history.
Which, yeah, that throws a massive wrench into a century of careful genetics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happens next? Will these highly specialized biological tanks and all-weather transformers be able to adapt quickly enough to climates that are now changing by the decade rather than by the century?
That's a great question.
Or will the ultimate global beef cow of the very near future need to look entirely different than anything we've talked about today?
That is the great looming unknown of the next era of agriculture.
It certainly makes you look at your dinner plate a little differently, doesn't it?